1, 2, 3. This is Dr. Alex Avila with Love University, and we're back. I'm an author, psychologist, and speaker. And every week we talk about how to love yourself, others, and a higher nature, how to improve your life in many ways. And today we're very fortunate to have a very esteemed guest. This is Father Gregory Boyle. Father Greg, or G as he's affectionately called, is a Jesuit priest, best-selling author, and the founder of Homeboy Industries, who helps former gang members transform their lives. He has various businesses dealing with food, cafe, farmers markets. They offer on-the-job training, and he has the largest gang rehabilitation and reentry program in the nation. And he's also won many awards: California Peace Prize, Champion of Change by the White House, and his calling is compassion, redemption, mercy, and also delighting in each other. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Alex. Good to be with you.
Gregory. And tu hablas español. Your Spanish is pretty good. I was talking to you a little bit beforehand.
Yeah.
So you got that. Now, I read your book. I've seen your material. There's some really wonderful things there. You talked about the fact that we're all trying to bear the beams of love. And I know you work with people that in some way have been discarded by society, marginalized, and how do you apply that to those people you work with, those young men and young women who've been through criminal backgrounds maybe and have had very difficult lives? How do you apply that idea?
Well, I think the principle, the secret sauce at Homeboy Industries is a community of tenderness. So the idea at Homeboy is that tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. It's how you move from love that is stuck in your head or your heart or the air, and it moves to connective tissue. So tenderness is this disarming way, especially with the population that I'm privileged to accompany, that it's a way of connecting to them, and where it leads to kind of an exquisite mutuality where there is no us and them, there's just us. So tenderness is the thing that we most try to focus on and try to stay anchored in.
We also talk about the power of divine love to transform human disgrace. And you say that that's one of the big elements, shame and disgrace is what, in a sense, fulfills addictions, or bad behaviors, is that we feel bad about ourselves. We're losers. So how does that happen where you transform it? And you have a beautiful phrase. You say, divine love turns woundedness into health, deformity into beauty, and embarrassment into laughter. How does that divine love help those who feel so down?
Well, part of the operative principle there is that shame and disgrace is the singular, suffering of the poor throughout history. And so part of the task is to, how do we together with each other reach in and dismantle the barriers that exclude, and how do we dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace? So those messages keep people from seeing the truth of who they are, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. And so at Homeboy, we don't really, hold the bar up and ask folks to measure up. But we hold the mirror up and say, well, here's your truth. It's like the Buddhist notion that says, "Oh, nobly born, remember who you truly are." And so that's what we try to kind of remind folks of.
Yes.
And so you do it, and that's in healing, and all that leads to kind of a relational wholeness that leads people to not ever reoffend and not return to prison, especially our population.
Yes, I like that. And the other thing I think you talk about is sometimes, you got to be hard on some of these gentlemen, or less disciplined, or these ladies. But you said you want to catch people doing things right. And many times we catch them doing wrong, but to reinforce positively. This is something that's very powerful in psychology, positive reinforcement. So how do you do that, like on a daily basis? How do you catch them doing things right?
Well, because they're endlessly doing things right, so you want to catch them in the act of doing something good and kind, and you're always trying to point that out. But they know better than anybody else, how they've colored outside the lines.
Exactly. Now the other thing is, this is a very fascinating quote, and when I read it, I wasn't quite sure what it meant. But you said, "God is greater than God." I thought, well, that sounds like a paradox. But then you said something like, the desire of God's heart is immeasurably greater than our own imagination. So tell me about that quote. How does that apply?
Well, God is greater than God is actually from Meister Eckhart, who's a theologian and mystic. And And so, sort of like St. Ignatius, I'm a Jesuit. Ignatius always talked about the God who's always greater. So once you think you've landed on a concept, a notion of who God is,
Yes.
just know that it's always greater than that. And so the God who's greater than God is the kind of always know that it's an evolution and a moving kind of sense of greater, expansive, spacious notion. So you don't want to settle for a partial God or a puny God or a lesser God.
Yes.
You're always moving in the direction of something greater and
Makes a lot of
larger.
sense. Yeah, because God can be more compassionate and forgiving than we even give him credit for.
Always.
And people often attack themselves because they don't think that God is for them. Right? They're always thinking that God's going to judge them or condemn them.
It's a puny, lesser, partial God
Exactly.
they've settled for.
Yeah, another phrase, I don't know if you like me telling you phrases, but, these are stuff.
Go ahead.
Okay. Is the idea that narrow is the gate that leads to life, and then you kind of turn that around a little bit. It says, don't focus on the narrow, but narrow the focus. And I kind of like that paradox. What does that mean, actually?
Well, I think it talks about it refers to the scriptural passage where it talks about, the gate is narrow, and we always think that it's supposed to limit us, that we won't get there,
Right.
And we're too bad or we're too disappointing.
Yes.
But it's about narrowness is a way of bringing focus to how you live. If you love being loving, then the chances are that you can narrow the focus of your life. And so many things get in the way, like waiting and reliant on outcomes and
Yes.
success and did I save the day? Did I rescue these folks? Did I save people? But if you just narrow the focus, which is to say to love being loving, then that has to be enough for you, and it can be enough. And in the end, that's the only thing that brings results and success anyway.
And the other thing is, Father Boyle, or Gregory, as you want me to call you, is I'm working on a new book that I call Love Q, or Love IQ. So love intelligence is, you've heard of emotional intelligence, right? And of course, regular intelligence, but spiritual intelligence, elements like compassion, gratitude, patience, and empathy are not as developed in human beings. But I know you work a lot with these elements, and you even talk about patience. You say there's I think a gang member, a female who came to work for you, and the first day she got into a fight. The second day she was high, and the third day she was in a stolen car with some homies. You kept her on. You didn't fire her. And you said most of the people that work for you probably will be fired at other jobs. So how do you have so much patience to keep giving them more opportunities than the average person?
Well, at Homeboy we try not to be tripped up by behavior, where and then we don't want to have some high moral distance between us and them.
Yes.
And so people are just trying to find their way. All behavior is a language, and it somehow, what language is this behavior speaking? And behavior that we'd all agree is kind of alarming is really about pain. So let's talk about the pain. Let's address the pain. How can we find healing? That's the only, but people settle for just this one thing, which is behavior change.
Yes.
Whereas we should try to get underneath things. Everything is about something else. So how do you get underneath things where somehow we're actually helping people heal and become whole?
Well, that's great. You sound like you have almost a psychological background. Did you study psychology back in the day? Or?
Oh, I don't know. I probably got more degrees than I need.
Okay. So you have a lot of that knowledge of that. I mean, basically underlying the feelings, underlying the behavior. Another one is empathy. Now, we talk about empathy, putting yourself in other people's shoes, and I think you said being one. And, in the Eastern way, there's something called Tonglen, which is a meditation where you basically breathe in the suffering of others and breathe out compassion.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you're doing this kind of exercise with your people, your young men and women in your organization at Homeboys. So how does that work? How does empathy created among these young men and women?
I think that the kind of variation on Tonglen would be, you breathe in the spirit that delights in your being, and then you exhale that into the world that needs it. And so, because we can focus on the suffering, but it's a little bit like catching people in the act of doing the right thing. You
Yes.
catch people, in their goodness. The Buddhist sayings that begin with "O nobly born, remember who you really are." So you're always trying to remind people who they really are, and you're trying to get to this place where they can delight in the present moment. And but yeah, no, I get all the Tonglen thing. I think it's quite helpful.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And yeah, I've worked actually with victims of crime and also ex-gang members through different programs therapeutically. And one of the gang members, he was critically injured by his own gang. And then he said he saw his mother in the hospital and he saw her eyes crying. And he said all of a sudden he saw the eyes of other mothers that his other children he had hurt, and that changed him. I think you talk about something similar to that in your writings. How does that work when they get to that point where they really see the suffering they have caused?
Well, I mean, in recovery, they always say it takes what it takes, and so what we're about at Homeboy Industries is recovery, really. So what does it take? It can be the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. It takes what it takes, and you can't manufacture that moment. So no amount of me wanting that guy to have a life will ever be the same as that guy wanting to have one. So, ours is a God who waits, and who are we not to wait? To wait for them to, and people come to stuff in their own time and in their own way.
It makes a lot of sense. And the idea of compassion, now compassion is to relieve the suffering of another. And this is something that you talk about kinship. And the kinship is basically someone that shares characteristics or origins. And often we say a blood kinship, but you're not talking about that. I think you're talking about human kinship. So that's another factor. How do we get to that point where we can teach young men and women and also others how to have that compassion, how to relieve that suffering of others?
Well, Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So if we stand against forgetting that, if we get to a place where we go, there is no us and them, there's just us, then we get to a place where we feel connected. And this is why kinship is so essential, because no peace, no kinship, no peace, no kinship, no justice, no kinship, no equality. And all those things are really byproducts of our kinship or our lack of kinship.
Wow, that's amazing.
So if you work for those things, the things that we all long for, peace, justice, and equality, well, they handle themselves if there's some undergirding sense that we belong to each other, that we're connected.
That's extremely powerful. And Gregory, you said something that kind of shocked me a little bit. You said, I'm not called to be successful, but only faithful. And you said that, you weren't sure if you're a success in certain ways. I mean, you said you've buried 200 people, right, over the years. And there's been a lot of pain. But at the same time, you've been faithful. And it kind of reminds me, again, of an Eastern idea that, we give the fruits of our labor to God. So, God is responsible for our happiness, not us. So that seems like a hard thing to do because a lot of people are ego-driven, right? We want to say we did this. So how do we get into that mindset?
Well, I think that's precisely the issue. If I were to say, I've just graduated from college and I'm going to go out there and I want to make a difference. And of course we think that's a good thing because it's other-centered. But the problem with it is that it's all about you. It's about you making a difference. Yes. And you don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. And once you turn that on its head, then there is no privilege, there's no white privilege, there's no to the rescue, there's no mindset that says, I'm going to save these people.
Yes.
I mean, I think saving lives is for the Coast Guard, so I'm not that interested in it.
Okay.
Yeah. So outcomes, results, and this is precisely why people don't endure in the work. They burn out.
Yes.
So if you're depleted in doing work at the margins, it's because you're doing it incorrectly. It's all about you. But if you go there and you allow yourself to be reached by the folks at the margins, then that's the only way it works, because then you're entering into the place of exquisite mutuality and everybody's inhabiting their own nobility and goodness. Yes. And that can only happen in this humble stance. So the difference is between humility and hubris, and Jesus was the example of humility. But hubris, where all the Humility asks this question: what would help you?
Yes.
But hubris doesn't ask a question; it makes a statement. It says, "Here's what your problem is," and that's kind of our stance because it's all about us. But the minute you can kind of ask the question or allow yourself to be reached,
Yes.
or to receive folks
Yes.
who carry more than everybody else, then that's when things change.
So that's very powerfully said. I mean, I like the way you kind of use paradox and kind of things that are not as commonly seen. But also, another thing that I've noticed throughout your work is that you use a lot of humor. I think you said the Jesuits are very funny people, so you have a lot of stories. And I like one, I don't know if you remember this one, about Letty, a homegirl who asked you about heaven. Do you remember that one? Or any other stories like that? Where she has said something like, I wish you were God. Do you remember that story? Can you tell our listeners any story like that, or do you remember anything that struck you?
Well, that story was she came in and she'd been through everything. Actually, she was from Cuba.
Oh, Cubana.
Yeah, and she came, she said, remember when Castro sent all the bad people to...
Marilitos.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how internalized she had
Wow.
internalized all that, well, that she was a bad person, and so
Yes.
were her parents. So she came in and asked me to help pay a bill or something.
Yes.
And then I was writing the check, and she got very misty-eyed and said, I wish you were God. And I said, why? She said, because I think you'd let me into heaven. And she started to sob.
Wow.
So I remember grabbing her hand, and I said, I'll tell you this much. If I get to heaven and you're not there, I'm not staying.
Oh, wow. I can see that. That kind of is very inspirational and funny at the same time.
Yeah.
But also kind of touching, too.
Yeah.
Because you're seeing the different dimensions of her personality and also your response to that. And the fact that you grew, too. I mean, as a human being, we grow as well, right? When we help others like that. And that's a beautiful statement. So, Gregory, it's been wonderful having you on the show today. I mean, I'm glad you took your time to
Thank
stop
you
by.
very much. It's been my pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. And tell us more. I mean, where can they reach Homeboy Industries and help contribute or be part of it? What can we do?
Homeboyindustries.org. They can just go to our website.
Okay, so you have that. Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
So again, I'd love to have you on again at some time if you like,
Thank
a
you.
different show. And this is Dr. Alex Avila, Love University. We're live at the USC Festival of Books. Gregory Boyle, Homeboy Industries, an amazing organization to help others transform lives and also to teach the wisdom of love. Until next time, Dr. Alex Avila, this is Love University.